Hello and welcome to DataU and this presentation on automating data modeling tasks. Today I'll be talking about automating tasks that you as data modelers do regularly in your work. I'll quickly go through some of the benefits of automation and then dive right into an example, hopefully giving you some insight along the way. My name is Jason Hahn. I am a developer here at Embarcadero. I've been working on ERStudio Data Architect and the ERStudio repository for about 15 years now. Alright, now that you know who I am, let's start with the what of automation. So, what tasks can we accomplish through automation? Well, anything that you have to do multiple times is a candidate for handling through automation. Also, tasks that have multiple steps are good candidates because the more complex the actions you're taking, the more potential gain there is to avoiding doing them manually. There are a ton of things that can benefit from all kinds of different kinds of automation. I listed some examples here. Obviously, when you build cars, you're doing the same steps over and over again. When you're naming constraints in your data model, you're following the same basic rules over and over again. And even when you're doing dishes at home, you're really just following certain steps multiple times, basically the same way every time. Now, what tools can we use to automate these tasks that we've identified? Well, ones that can repeat actions the same way again and again. Pretty obvious, but also tools that can kind of adjust based on input. So you don't want something that is too strict because you want to be able to have it adjust based on small changes that you have to what you're giving it. Obviously some tools that map with the examples we had earlier are assembly lines for cars, macros for naming constraints in your data model might be helpful, and of course dishwashers are a great way to automate doing dishes. Unfortunately for me, my family doesn't have an automatic dishwasher in our home, so we're kind of out of luck there, but I do have ERStudio's macro editor, so I'm going to be using the constraint naming example later on in just a few minutes. Now that we've identified a few tasks maybe that could be automated, we really want to know why we should be going through the effort of setting up the automation when we can just do the tasks manually. Okay, well, like most of what we've been talking about, the first answer is pretty obvious. You want efficiency, right? An initial investment in an automated process can really pay off if you use the automated task over and over again. Every time you need to accomplish that goal, you go and reuse your automated process and you save time. The more you do it, the more time you save, the more effort you save. But I think that even more than just plain old efficiency gains, there's another benefit, and that's consistency. So, automated processes don't forget things. Once you've written it, you can expect consistent results every time. Macro doesn't forget a step just because it forgot to have its cup of coffee in the morning. Versus if you're doing something manually, maybe you just forget one tiny little thing you don't notice, then it crops up later and causes you a bigger headache. So it's not just faster to do the work, but it saves time later in solving problems, avoiding problems, and stuff like that. So another part of consistency is that your output kind of follows the same pattern every time. You can feel confident that you know what you're going to get when you look at the results of a macro. A lot more so than if you're just doing everything manually. This helps if you want to make changes later on, even if you didn't make a mistake, but if you used some sort of automated task, and later on if you want to make a change, you know that, hey, I know what I have to find and replace in order to update this. I don't have to worry about outliers or things that don't fit the pattern. So all this consistency is great because it leads to greater efficiency, of course. So now that we know why you might want to automate a task, when would you not want to automate a task? Well, again, the question is all about efficiency. Some tasks are temporary. You're only going to do them a few times and never going to have to do them again. Is it really worth the effort to automate it when you're just going to throw away that macro and not use it again, or whatever the tool is you're using? Also, if a task is complex. Now, generally, complex tasks are good candidates for automation, but if it's too complex, then the tool you're creating, the macro or whatever it is, might be too complex as well to make it worth it. You don't want a bunch of steps that you have to add your macro and checks and if this and then that and stuff for hundreds of different possibilities that you could probably do by hand just as easily. So you have to kind of be wary of those tasks that are so complex that they don't fit into something that could be reused. Similarly, if a task has too many dependencies or too much input, then again you're not gaining any efficiency by spending the time to automate the task when compared to how much time it might take to do it manually. Now that you've decided you want to automate a task, question is, how can you do it? So let me show you. Okay, so for this example, I've got ERStudio Data Architect open. I'll be using the emergency admissions sample model that comes with ERStudio. And the scenario that we're going to solve is that we've been asked to no longer use system-generated names for not null constraints in our Oracle databases. So we've got to go through and update or set the not null constraint name for all the columns in our Oracle physical models. So for example, let me edit admission here. We've got 4 columns that are not null. I can edit patient ID, for example, and there's no constraint name set in ERStudio. Most likely no default, or just using the system generated name in the database. So we'd like to go through and set these names here in ERStudio in our data model so that they can eventually be updated as necessary in the database. What we're going to be using is a pretty straightforward naming convention. I'll start with NN underscore for not null. Then we'll be typing in the table name underscore column name. In this case, that's patient ID, and that will be our not null constraint name. So let's just show over here in the DDL. Got constraint name added here. So that's what we want, is our DDL to show the constraint name. Going back though, we have an extra little wrinkle we need to worry about. We need to make sure these constraint names are 30 characters or less. So if we go to admitting nurse and we do our regular, let me copy this name here, we do our regular NN underscore admission for the table name underscore admitting nurse ID. Now we have a constraint name that is 31 characters. Trust me on that, I counted. So our boss has told us that the naming convention is to start with the first character after the prefix, the NN underscore prefix, and remove each vowel until we get it down to 30, except we're not supposed to remove that first vowel. You don't want to make it admission. So we'll leave that one there and get the very next vowel and delete it and keep doing that until we get down to 30. In this case, since it was only 31 characters, we just have to do 1. And we hit OK and go over the DDL, and now we have and admission, admitting nurse ID as our constraint name. So as you can see, now it's getting a little bit more complicated with the checking, removing of the vowels, making sure they're 30 characters, and there's still 2 more columns in this table, let alone the other 14 tables in the model. So we're going to go ahead and automate this task. So let me cancel out of here and discard these changes so we can do it properly in a macro. Now, 3 major themes I'm going to be hitting on while I'm writing this macro with you, and those are readability, reuse, and robustness. Good error checking, making sure that it works under many cases. So just be prepared. I'm going to go over those over and over and over again. Okay, so let's start off on our macro tab and just add a new macro. Okay, we've got our Ear Studio macro editor open here. The first thing that I like to do, and this has to do with readability, is to add a little set of comments at the top to indicate what this macro is supposed to be, and a few other pieces of information. So, okay. So now that we have a little bit of information in here, I'm going to go ahead and save it right away. Just save as. This brought me to the sample macros folder, physical modeling Oracle macros, because this is an Oracle specific, so I'll go ahead and take advantage of that, taking me just to the right place, and save it here. Okay, now we're ready to get started on real code. First thing we got to do is grab the active diagram and the active model to make sure we're running on the entities or the tables in that active model. So I've got a couple variables there, one for the diagram, one for the model, and I'm going to assign them to the active diagram and active model. Now, back to readability. So I use D and M as kind of shorthand for diagram and model, but that's not very readable for other people using this later. Maybe later in the macro they're going to see a D, and is that a domain? Is that the diagram? It takes a few extra moments to type in a little bit longer name, but I think it's worth it in the long run, especially because you don't ever really know when you're going to be confused by a shorthand. Just a little extra time in the beginning, and now we know that we're talking about the active diagram or the active model. Seems kind of silly sometimes, but these little things actually really save you a lot of time later on. So now that makes it a little bit more readable, but we have to think about robustness. First thing is trying to consider all possible scenarios. Maybe it's not you running this macro, maybe it's your coworker you gave it to. They're supposed to work on the Oracle models in their division. So they open it up and they run the macro, but they don't have a diagram open. Is this going to work? No, actually it will fail. So we need to add a little bit of robustness, a little error checking here, and make sure that we can handle these cases nicely so that the user can overcome them quickly and easily if they mess up on first try. Okay, I've added a couple extra lines of code. Basically it's checking the active diagram after we try and get it, and if it's nothing, that means no diagram is open, so we put up a little message box saying please open a diagram, and immediately quit. If there's no active model, well, that doesn't happen, because if you have a diagram open there's always an active model, so we instead check to see if the active model is a logical model, because obviously there's no not null constraints in the logical model. In this case, then we say this model is designed to be run on Oracle physical model, please switch to an Oracle physical model and try again. So now we have the makings of a macro. It's always good to kind of run as you go and check things as you go. So let's make sure the code we have in here is correct. One thing I use is this immediate window, which is kind of a logging window. Debug.print is how you print something out to it. So I will print out the name of the model, maybe. Okay, and let's save this and run it and see what happens. Okay, shows up here, physical. That's the name of the physical model, and so we have successfully gotten the active diagram and the active model. Again, with our error checking our descriptive variable names. If you just want to make sure your error checking is working, you can switch over here to logical, run it again, and we get an error. This macro is designed to be run from Oracle Physical Models. Please switch and try again. So that part is working as well. So now you kind of feel comfortable that what you've done so far is working. You can move on to the next step. So I think now we want to go ahead and loop through all the tables and columns in the model. So first, to do that in these macros, you create variables, again with reasonably descriptive names, and you start an empty loop to loop through all of them in the active model. So here we have for each entity in the active model and each attribute in the current entity. Again, we want to test, make sure that what we're doing is working. So a simple way to do it is to debug.print current entity dot name. See if that works. We have a problem. Again, this is why we check. So, method or property not found. Entity doesn't have a property called name. That's because it has a property called table name or entity name. What we want is table name. So we will run this, and I was wrong. Current entity does not have something called table name. It has something called table name. And we're still in the logical model, see? I highly recommend actually doing this. I mean, it seems like there's all these little mistakes, but this is how you create the macro. You test it, and you solve these issues as you go, and it makes it so much easier going forward for you. Alright, now I think we've got it. If I run this, I do see all of the first the model and then all the table names, so that's correct. Let me add a little bit better information to my logging there, and maybe here, there. Okay, let's try this again, and alright, that looks a little bit better, so we understand what's going on. And we can do the same thing for attributes. So let's take this, let's add it inside this loop, column name, and see what we get. Okay, now we got a lot of logging output. Each table, each column. Alright. Let's clean that up a little bit. Instead of doing the table, let's just add the table name to the column output. So we can do the table name and maybe dot and column name. We'll delete this part here, so now it should have kind of the table.column notation for each column name, and try it. And again, that works better, and we can feel comfortable that we are correctly going through all the entities or tables and columns in the physical model. Now the next step is for our task. We're looking for columns that have that are not null and don't have not null constraint names. So we can get started looking for that. So we want to, if it's a not null, so I'm going to put if not current attribute.null option, then right, and an else in there too, and we'll just move this debug print. So make sure that we're correctly finding the null option for each attribute, and we'll run it again, make sure that's correct. And we have a type mismatch on null option. Okay, so what's the problem here? Well, let's go to our object browser, see what the issue is. It took us right to the attribute object, current attribute. Let's look for null option here and read the help string. This is the nullability of the attribute. Values are null or not null. So, aha, it takes a string that says either null or not null. It's not a Boolean like I guessed. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to stop the macro, and then I'm going to change this to check against not null. And see if that works better. And yes, it does. And now we have a big list of columns and whether they are null or not null. Let's make sure that's correct. So I have here admission with patient ID, admitting nurse as not null, and then release comments and release time are nullable. And if we just look over here in the model, that is accurate. So we know we did that part correctly, and we can move on to the next one. Now, I talked a little bit about readability. I talked a little bit about robustness. So the next thing I want to talk about is reusability and code reuse. So reuse is just another form of automation. The same ideas that happen when you're trying to figure out whether you want to write a macro to do a job. You need to consider whether it's reasonable to write a function or a subroutine to do work that gets done repeatedly in your macro. So if we're looking at this here, we're doing some work. We're combining the table name with a dot and the column name. What if we wanted to change it, instead of a dot, we want to make it a colon, right? So we change it to colon and we run it, and we see that, oops, we forgot to change the second one. This sounds like a candidate for code reuse. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new function to do this work for us, right? Luckily, I have that function already written up for you. You don't have to watch me type it. So we have table and column name, just combines the table name and column name. We're going to fix it up a little bit because we want it to be more reusable. We want to actually be able to specify how we want to separate the two, right? Maybe you want the colon, maybe you don't. So we're going to add something called delimiter as a string, and use that here instead. So in this spot, we are going to call the function instead, and we want to go ahead and use dot notation. That's fine. So it sends the entity object, which then figures out the table name, and the attribute object, which figures out the column name. And we can do that same thing down here, and now we can we have some code reuse. Right? Let's test it, make sure it's working, and all looks good. Now, in the sake of robustness, another kind of trick that's specific to the RStudio macro, but is important to do, is to check for error. Now, it's important to always check for an error. I'll show you the trick for this kind of macro. For example, let's say you had code that did current attribute dot Teradata using sample. Okay, you wanted to print that out. Now that's not going to work. We are an Oracle platform, but if we run it, it still returns something false. What does that mean? Well, how do we know that that's not right? Maybe it's better to check to see if there's some sort of error. And the way that we do that in RStudio is we check the function diagram manager.getLast error code, and print that out. Okay. These two functions return an error code or error string based on if a function that you ran doesn't apply or has some other error when you ran it. It gets reset every time you call another function. So say if you just call it after each one, then you should get the proper error, and this is what it looks like. Models database platform doesn't support Teradata using sample, which makes sense. Okay, so that's a good idea to do. Now, of course, if you're going to be checking this all over the place after each function you call, then probably a good idea to put it in a function or a subroutine. So I will go ahead and add a function that does that. Okay, so here's my little function that I like to use, subroutine, and all it does is check for error. So we can change this to simply check for error. I'm going to comment out the message box part so we don't see it for every column, but if I run this, now this check for error is reporting the error of using sample every time. I'm going to add check for error in quite a few places. I mean, you don't need it everywhere, but I like to have it every time I call something like null option, where maybe this is not, valid for the platform or something like that. So we've got some readable variable names. We've got error checking, robustness. We've got code reuse. We've got a couple of subroutine and a function here, so we can reuse the code. It makes it easier to make changes going forward. We're getting closer. Now let's just add the actual meat of this macro. First thing we're going to do is check for the not null constraint name, right? If the column already has a constraint name, we don't want to change it. We want to leave that alone. We're assuming it's done correctly. So we create a string variable, not null constraint name, and assign it to the value of the current attribute's not null constraint name. Always check for error, and we can actually run this right now, just to make sure that no errors come up. So let's check it. Okay, no, I don't see any errors here. That's good. So now we have this constraint name. If you want, we can even output it just to make sure it's showing up. Okay, so for all the not null ones, we have a lot of empty spaces. None of them have a not null constraint name. Alright, so the next step is to verify that the constraint name is non-empty, or that it is empty. So if it's 0, then we want to do our work. So this is where we're going to be doing the setting of the constraint name. Luckily, first of all, we know that our format is going to be nn underscore table and column name, right? Well, we have a table and column name function already done here, so let's reuse it. Let's go in here, set the constraint name. Make sure we type it correctly. Equals nn underscore and table and column name. Current. Let's copy that. But remember, we want to use underscores to separate the table and the column name. So let's try that. Let's see if that works. Before we actually set it in the column, let's again test it and run this. And now we have some not null constraint names. Okay, so we're doing good. Now, one minor detail, and I'll just go through it quickly, is I don't like these strings in the middle of the code. It's not that big of a deal again, but you're trying to make it clean, make it easier to change. What if in the future you want to name it just with a single n or something like that? You're going to have to look through the code, find it. It's probably easier to have some sort of constant value here. Okay, and I like to put the constants up here. Const there. So we have this value. We can also for use later, add a const for maximum name length, make that 30, and use that. Again, let's run it, test it, and okay, we still got the NN underscore good. Now we got to check it for a maximum of 30 characters. So again, it's always wise to do simple steps first, make sure they work, and then go to the more complicated. So the first thing we're going to do is just truncate it. So equals, and oh, I don't want to use 30. I want to use our constant here, and here. And so let's run this. And did we get any? Yep, yes we did. So here's admitting nurse ID. That was the one we used before, right? So the D got truncated to make it 30 characters. So now we know that we are finding the constraint name, making sure it's proper length, and fixing it if it's not. Okay, so one major task to go is to fix it properly, right? We don't want to just truncate, we want to follow the rules that we set up earlier. Well, lucky for you, I'm not going to go ahead and write that function. I already have it written. So this is our macro here. Now it looks all nice and good, but you know, if you're just looking at this, you won't understand what it's doing. So again, one key portion of writing macros, and what's something that I've failed to do so far in this demonstration, is to use comments to explain what's going on. We really want to have other people reading this understand what we're doing, so we can add a few comments here. So if the name is already valid, return immediately. Okay, here in this loop, we loop through each character, assigning it to the new name variable unless it's supposed to be skipped. Here we want to point out that we're skipping vowels, and here we want to point out that we don't skip the vowel if it's the very first character. Okay, and almost done. And finally, we actually do the assignment of the next character. Okay, so now we have a few comments in here. It's a little more helpful when somebody's trying to read and understand the code. You know, now we have some comments that make this a little bit more readable, a little more understandable for someone, even yourself, coming back to it a little bit later. And we're going to go ahead and use this function back up earlier where we had our constraint name, and instead of just truncating. And through some more magic, I just rearranged the code quite a bit to get to where we're trying to go, which is to finally combine the table names, reduce the size if necessary to 30, and make sure the prefix is correct, and here we have a debug log. I'm going to erase these extra debug logs to clean that up a little bit so we can see, and run it to see what we have. Now we're not actually setting it in the column yet, but we're going to run and see what it says that we're getting, just to test it. Okay, we have patient ID set correctly here, and admitting nurse ID. We're no longer truncating the D at the end. We're getting rid of the I here. That looks correct. So we're looking good. Now we can go ahead and set it on the attributes or the columns. All right. And make sure we check for error. Okay, if you're ready, I'm ready. We're gonna run it. Looks okay from here. Let's check the admission DDL, And hey, look at that. Not null constraints. Probably with the I missing, set the patient ID correctly, I think we're good. So, after all of that work, we have a macro. Let's make sure we save it. Save often. I didn't, but you should. We have this macro here that can go through and update the constraint names for the columns in our physical model. We see did a pretty good job, set them all. We can run it again if we want. Let's run it again. Make sure that it doesn't mess up if it already finds some columns that have a name, and run it. Oh, worked well. We didn't find any because we set them all last time, so that's great. So now we have a macro that we can run anytime on the entire model. It'll only add constraint names for ones that need them. There's a million things you can do with this further. You can set it to only do the selected tables. You can have it verify that the current constraint name matches our format that we're looking for, and a million other things. Okay, so to wrap up, remember the things we discussed already. We talked about making sure identify which tasks makes most sense for automating. Cost benefit analysis of how long it'll take you to do the work based on how complex it is, and also how often you'll be using it, reusing it. A lot of times it makes sense when you're doing something over and over again. I mean, these things, it seemed like a little daunting to set up in the beginning, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be faster, and it'll be easier to find tasks that are worth the investment. Once you decide to go ahead and do it, remember to make code readable, to make code reusable. Write those functions, those subroutines if you need them. That another mini form of automation that'll help make your code robust. Add the error checking, handle edge cases. Is the diagram not even open? Is this a logical model? Test as you go. Keep running everything you're doing, and you'll actually have very solid, very helpful macros that will make your work more efficient. Make your entire group more efficient, hopefully make you a happier data modeler going forward. So go off and write some macros with all this information, and if you find one that does the dishes, please let me know. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, so we've gotten a number of good questions during this session. The first one came from Joel, and he said, can you please explain the hierarchy of the tool? At the top level, you have the file, then diagram, and model. Is that correct so far? How many models can you have in one diagram, or how many diagrams can you have in the model? Jason, I know you answered this, but go ahead and explain and walk through your answer.
For a DM1 file, which is the file that's saved out by EarStudio, you're going to have one diagram, what we call a diagram per file. So, those are kind of interchangeable in the way we talk about our models. Each diagram can have one logical model. We kind of enforce one logical model for every file, and then you can have as many physical models as you'd like. Underneath that, I've seen dozens in some files, and then within each model, you can have kind of subsets, different displays. I mean, the names kind of get confusing. We call the graphical display of the objects. We also call that the diagram. You can have a separate graphical display of your objects in a submodel, and you can have many, hundreds of submodels in a model if you really need to. So basically, the hierarchy is diagram at the top, and then one-to-many models underneath it, and then in each model you can have one-to-many submodels that have different graphical displays of the objects in the model.
Great, thanks, Jason. You got a compliment here from Sebastian. He said, "Nice VB coding live demo." How long in months is the learning curve for all of these methods, properties, inheritance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on the individual. Obviously, I think as I said in the thing, I don't even know all of the methods and the properties and the objects and inheritance myself for this tool. I do a lot of searching and checking the help, and even checking online when I'm trying to figure out what the best object is and what's available. Um, there's actually quite a few, and other people have asked for resources online. I know there are resources online of other data modelers who use ERStudio, who are familiar with the automation interface, and who kind of promote macro use and have examples. So I don't know if you ever get to the point where you learn it all, but it shouldn't take too long to actually get working. I don't even think it would take months. Probably just take a week or two to just get familiar with where to look first, and then just use your resources to find answers as you need them.
And then practice makes perfect. So
right,
the more you play with it, the easier it gets. Lindsay said, "What can't a macro do?"
Dishes. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, if that's a serious question, there are a few things. I mean, our ERStudio automation interface is pretty comprehensive. It doesn't have 100% coverage, but it's pretty comprehensive. Right down to most of the specific platform like storage options or not null naming constraints. Those are, or excuse me, not null constraint names. Those are all kind of available in there as well. So, even if you can't find it at first glance, sometimes you have to find the right name for it. You should be able to find almost everything.
Great. Okay. Alf asked, if table name is nearly 30 characters, you may risk making the same constraint name for several fields. Could a truncation table name be an idea, maybe to 15 characters?
Yeah. As I mentioned, that's probably a better idea than mine. I mean, I just kind of grabbed one for the demo, but you got to think about this ahead of time, and then actually that's why I love doing something like a macro. Is you code it in your macro, and then you don't have to remember what the is this truncating the table at 15 characters first, or is it you just go to the truncate the whole thing? Once you make your macro and run it, then it's kind of set in stone, and you don't have to worry about it being forgotten.
Great. Suni has asked, is there an open ERStudio macros community that ERStudio users can access? It'll help to be able to reuse a macro that's been built rather than build it from scratch. I'd actually like to pitch it on this. There is an ERStudio user group community on LinkedIn, and people do submit questions and challenges there, and it's not specifically focused on macros, but certainly that could be a topic to share there. Another plug I'll make is the newly updated Embarcadero user community, community.embarcadero.com, and we are adding and expanding our database content to this community, and macros would be a great topic to bring up there. So if you want to sign up for the Embarcadero community at community.embarcadero.com, then you can kick that off for us.
Yeah, I think sharing macros is always been a popular user forum kind of activity. I remember, maybe a decade ago, seeing on the InfoAdvisor site a lot of sharing of macros and stuff like that. So there are definitely places to look, and hopefully the Embarcadero community site can build up a good collection of user supplied and provided macros.
Great. InfoAdvisors is definitely an excellent resource.
Yeah.
Okay. Lindsay also asked, can I create a new model, submodel, or picture via a macro?
Yes, you can. There's a collection called models in the diagram, and you can add. There's an add func method. So same thing with submodels. There's an add method in the model. Generally you want to look at the hierarchy and then and find the parent, and then there should be an add a collection of the objects and an add function in that collection. But absolutely, you can do all that stuff.
Great. I just wrote yes, so if you want to add some more in the actual answer box, that'd be great.
Sure,
Alf asks, is this demo available? And of course, this session will be available via replay. But do you have a CANS demo version of this, Jason, or how would a customer be able to replicate this themselves?
Sorry, if I have a CAM version of this, I didn't hear that part.
A canned demo, if there's something that's downloadable off our website, or another resource for customers to do the similar type of thing.
Yeah, I think you'd want to go to when we post these videos for the DataU, if you want to see the video, if you want to see the macro that I actually wrote, we can probably find a way to get it to you. The text itself, but I think the video is probably best to watch on the DataU site when that's up.
And when we post all of the sessions and the presentations on the DataU site, we could also post the source document if you want to share that.
Yeah, I think that's probably best. That way, anybody who wants to review the demo can see it and follow along to the final document.
Great. All right. Next question from Lindsay is, I know standard Virtual Basic does file I/O. Does this version? I'm not parsing that question correctly.
Yeah. Sure, you can create dialogues. Some of the sample macros we have in our product have dialogues in them. It's not as fancy as maybe Visual Basic or some things that some other tools can get, but sure, it works well. You can ask for user input. It's kind of too much effort for this demonstration, but that's available, and I definitely recommend looking at some of the sample macros and how they both create UI, dialogues, and also how they interact with something like Excel.
Looks like we have a question from JC that says this might be best done in physical implementation rather than in model, but I recommend using the database to fix and query columns and constraints instead of using macros. In Oracle, I use Dynamic SQL to generate other scripts and fix the tables and constraints issues. Do modeling tools need to be more oriented to modeling and documenting data flow processes? And we have Ron Huzenga, our product manager, on the line who responded to that one. Ron, do you want to share?
Yes. Generally speaking, the major value in the model is the collaboration, particularly when you're working with large data architecture and development teams. And in most of my projects over the last years, we ensured that all the rigor was applied to the model. So we were doing agile development, for example, and the model was the database in terms of all of the physical characteristics were modeled, forward engineered, and generated out so that everybody was singing from the same songbook, so to speak, because we would then deploy into the different environments and everything else, but all changes would be communicated and originated back in the model and then pushed all the way through. And when you do that, you have one source of record and no room for confusion.
The next question from Sebastian is, can the macro get the GUI context, for example, custom actions? Back to Jason.
Yeah, and unfortunately the answer to that is no. So if you have some automated task that you want to go through the GUI, I mean, like I said earlier, a lot of it's automated, but maybe some of the wizards, you have specific tasks you want to do. That's not available in our automation interface.
Okay, thank you. And the last question I see right now is from Lindsay. I think it's clarification from the previous comment. It says, right. File I/O read and write to and from an Excel file, for example, or Word. So I think those are some of the functions she wanted.
Yeah, and the answer to that is absolutely yes. It's actually the same answer as before, because the sample macros do a lot of reading and writing to Excel, and I'm not sure if any of them have or show any writing to Word, although I don't see why that would be a problem. But absolutely, we have internally, some of our internal macros we use can write out to a text file, and so we can write XML or JSON data to a text file, and the Excel is actually widely used in our sample macros. It's a great resource just because it makes it visually appealing to see the data in the Excel spreadsheet. So absolutely, that's possible.
Excellent. Thanks so much. One more question just popped in from Cheryl. Oh, two more. From Cheryl, are there any plans to enhance the macro designer? I'm asking about simple functionality like find and replace.
Yeah, actually, I didn't show it in the demo. The find and replace are available if you right-click. In fact, there's quite a few things that are available when you right-click, including find and replace. It's not as user-friendly as we'd like, so something like hitting F3, it doesn't actually work in this macro designer. So that stuff is available. You just go and right-click and peruse through the menu items. And we are actually enhancing the macro designer, or at least upgrading it. The next version of our release, XE6, is coming out this year. Should have an updated version of the macro UI. I don't think we have any specific enhancements planned for it other than just upgrading the new version and any fixes that the third-party software has added. But that's something we're looking at too, is making something like find and replace easier, that kind of stuff, going forward.
Okay, great. I think, let's see, Alf has asked, when writing macros, could I then write to other file formats other than Word and Excel?
Sure, yeah, I mean, text documents are easy, but any application that has a COM interface, you can access through our macros. And also, you don't have to actually use our SACS Basic interface. You can write C# programs to access through our automation interface, C++, Visual Basic. If you have Visual Basic stuff instead of the one that comes with our application, all of that can access the automation interface as well. So you can both write in another program to access ER Studio and write macros in ER Studio to access other programs that have a COM interface.
And all of this, David,
could Delphi also be used?
Yeah, you can use Delphi. Just say install, and then go and find the COM automation interfaces for your Studio, and all of a sudden they'll all show up as components in Delphi and C++ Builder, so you can use them.
Yeah, actually we have quite a few Delphi examples by one of our support agents who does a lot of macro work, and he likes to use Delphi to do the work here too, so that's definitely a good option.
Okay, great. Stuni asked, in ER Studio data lineage, we are unable to copy and edit the data flow. Is there a macro that can do this function?
Yeah, there's a visual data lineage export to Excel and import to Excel, or import from Excel. So that is the best way to do what you're looking for. That's how we do it. You can export one data flow and import into another one, and it works pretty well. It's something we've added recently and done some testing on. Just make sure you're using the visual data lineage import and export. There's another one just called data lineage, which uses our older data lineage system.
Okay, great, excellent. Mary has asked, can a user who does not have administrative rights to their PC use the features we have seen today, including the metadata bridges?
Yeah, I don't see any reason why not.
I mean, having admin rights to your PC is whether or not you can install software on it, perhaps.
Right.
So but you have to install the MetaWizard, or is that just accessible through the application if ER Studio is already installed?
Yeah, if ER Studio is installed, it's available if you have the proper licensing for it, and it shouldn't require administrative privileges, especially for ER Studio. Some repository things you need special privileges when you're on the server, obviously, but ER Studio itself should be able to run pretty well without administrative rights.